A simple trip to the vet with my dog turned into a scary moment when 5 white men thought I was an easy target. What they didn't know was that my dog Scott wasn't just any dog. He was going to be their worst nightmare. They thought they could rob an old, helpless man, but by the end of this story, they'd learn a lesson they'd never forget. So you don't miss any heartwarming stories, subscribe to my channel and hit the notification bell right away. Let us start from the very beginning. My name is Samuel Johnson. I'm 60 years old, a widower, and I live alone in a small, quiet neighborhood. Life is simple now, but it wasn't always like this. I spent 35 years working at a bank, balancing accounts and helping people manage their money. It was a steady job, one that kept food on the table and a roof over my family's head. But those days are long gone. My wife passed away a few years ago, and since then, it's just been me and the memories we built together. Age has caught up with me. I'm not as strong as I used to be. Arthritis slows me down, and some days, even walking to the bus stop feels like climbing a mountain. Still, I keep going. I've always had a strong will, and I refuse to let the aches and pains get the better of me. My mind is sharp, and that keeps me grounded. Thankfully, I'm not completely alone. I have Scott, my dog, and my loyal companion. Scott is no ordinary dog. He's a bloodhound species and a retired canine police officer. Back in his prime, Scott was known for his courage and sharp instincts. He worked in law enforcement, helping to catch criminals and protect lives. But as life often does, it threw him a curveball. Scott got sick, and the force decided it was time for him to retire. That's when I found him. Or maybe it's more accurate to say he found me. I had been struggling with loneliness after losing my wife. The house was too quiet, the days too long. A friend suggested I adopt a dog, and when I heard about Scott, I didn't think twice. Scott was exactly what I needed. He's incredibly well-trained, disciplined, and most importantly, protective. At the same time, he has a gentle side that brings comfort on my toughest days. He's not just a dog, he's family. Over time, we've developed a routine. We go on walks together, sit in the park, and even share quiet moments on the couch. He understands me in a way most humans wouldn't. Now Scott lives a peaceful life, far from the dangers of his old job. He's my support dog, my companion, and in many ways my guardian. When we walk down the street, I always feel safe, knowing Scott is by my side. He may not be chasing down criminals anymore, but he hasn't forgotten his training. On this particular day, I was taking Scott to the vet for a routine checkup. We were heading to the bus station, as I don't drive anymore. It seemed like any other day, just an old man and his dog on a quiet walk. Little did I know the peace wouldn't last. But with Scott by my side, I was ready for whatever was coming, even if I didn't know it yet. The morning was sunny and bright, the kind of day that feels full of promise. I had an appointment at the vet for Scott later that morning, so I made sure we left the house with plenty of time. I don't drive anymore. It's been years since I sold my car. My hands aren't steady enough for the wheel, and my reflexes just aren't what they used to be. So the bus has become my main way of getting around. It's not so bad. I like watching the world go by from the window, and the walk to the bus stop gives me a bit of exercise. Scott trotted beside me, his ears perking up at the occasional sound of birds or rustling leaves. His leash was slack in my hand. He never pulled or tugged. He didn't need to. Scott was so well trained, he always stayed in step with me. It was one of the many things I loved about him. He made me feel steady, even when my legs didn't want to cooperate. The street was quiet that morning, unusually so. Normally, there were a few neighbors out tending their gardens or walking their own dogs, but today it felt like the world was still asleep. It wasn't eerie, just peaceful. The kind of silence that makes you appreciate the little things, like the warmth of the sun on your face or the sound of Scott's paws gently patting against the sidewalk. As we walked, I couldn't help but feel grateful for Scott's presence. He wasn't just a pet. He was my protector, my friend, and in some ways, my reason to keep moving forward. Losing my wife had left a hole in my life, one I thought would never be filled. But Scott brought a sense of purpose back to my days. He needed me, and I needed him. I glanced down at him and smiled. "Are you ready for the vet, boy?" I asked. His ears twitched, and he gave a small wag of his tail. I could tell he wasn't thrilled about the idea of another checkup, but he'd go along with it because that's just the kind of dog he is, loyal to the core. We were getting closer to the bus stop when I noticed how empty the street seemed. There were no cars passing by, no one out walking or jogging. It felt odd, but I didn't think much of it at the time. With Scott by my side, I always felt safe. He had this presence about him, a quiet confidence that made me feel like nothing bad could happen as long as he was there. I tightened my grip on his leash and kept walking, enjoying the sunshine and the cool breeze. It felt like a normal day, just another trip to the vet. I had no idea that in just a few minutes, everything would change. But Scott, he'd been ready for whatever was coming all along. We were just a few minutes away from the bus stop when I noticed them. 5 men standing near the mouth of an alleyway, leaning against the wall like they didn't have a care in the world. Something about the way they watched me made my stomach turn. I tightened my grip on Scott's leash, my steps slowing as I considered crossing the street. But it was too late. One of them stepped out onto the sidewalk, blocking my path. He was tall, maybe in his mid-20s, with a cocky smirk on his face. The others followed close behind him, spreading out slightly as if to corner me. "Hey, old man," the leader said, his tone dripping with mockery. "Why don't you make this easy and hand over your wallet?" I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I hadn't been in a situation like this before, and I wasn't sure what to do. My first instinct was to reason with them, to appeal to whatever shred of decency they might have. "I don't have much," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Please, just let me go. I'm just an old man walking his dog." The leader chuckled, and the others joined in, their laughter echoing off the walls of the alley. "Oh, we're not asking for much," he said, taking a step closer. "Just your wallet, maybe that watch too, and who knows, maybe we'll keep the dog." At that, Scott let out a low, rumbling growl. It was a sound I hadn't heard from him before, deep and menacing. The leader's smirk faltered for just a moment, but he quickly recovered. "Relax, Mutt," he said, waving a hand dismissively. "You don't scare me." The men began to close in, forming a loose circle around me and Scott. My hands trembled as I held onto the leash, unsure of what to do next. "Please," I said again, my voice cracking, "you don't have to do this." One of them sneered, "Oh, we want to do this." The leader reached out, grabbing the strap of my bag. I instinctively pulled back, but I wasn't strong enough to stop him. He yanked it free and tossed it to one of the others. "See?" he said, grinning. "That wasn't so hard, was it?" I felt helpless, the weight of my frailty crushing down on me. But then Scott moved. He stepped in front of me, his body tense and his eyes locked onto the men. His growl grew louder, more aggressive, and the air around us seemed to shift. "Look at the dog trying to play hero," one of them sneered. They didn't know what was coming. And in that moment, I realized that Scott did. He wasn't going to let them get away with this. The moment one of the men grabbed my arm, everything seemed to slow down. My breath caught in my throat, and I froze, unsure of what to do. But Scott didn't hesitate. His instincts kicked in immediately, and before I could even process what was happening, he launched himself at the man holding me. Scott's body hit him like a freight train, knocking him to the ground. The man let out a startled scream as Scott's jaws clamped onto his forearm, forcing him to release me. The other men shouted in alarm, and the sound of their footsteps rushing toward us snapped me out of my shock. "Scott!" I shouted, my voice trembling. "Stay close!" Scott didn't turn to look at me, but I knew he heard me. He kept his body low, circling back toward me while keeping his eyes on the remaining attackers. One of the men picked up a metal pipe from the ground and swung it towards Scott. My heart jumped into my throat, but Scott was too quick. He darted to the side, avoiding the swing with ease, and lunged at the man's leg. The thug screamed as Scott's teeth sank into his calf, and he crumpled to the ground, clutching his injured leg. "What the hell kind of dog is this?" one of them yelled, panic evident in his voice. Another man pulled out a knife, his hand trembling slightly as he pointed it at Scott. "You think you're tough, huh, dog?" he spat, taking a step closer. Scott let out a low, menacing growl that sent chills down my spine. His focus was laser sharp, and he waited for the man to make the first move. When the thug lunged forward, Scott dodged to the side and went straight for his wrist. The knife clattered to the ground as the man cried out in pain, trying to shake Scott off. I stood there gripping Scott's leash tightly, feeling both terrified and awestruck. My mind raced, but my body felt frozen in place. I wanted to help, to do something, but I knew I'd only get in the way. Scott was in control. The two men still standing exchanged nervous glances. "Forget this," one of them said, backing away. "I'm not dying for this crap." The other man hesitated, his fists clenched, before spitting on the ground and turning to follow. They disappeared into the shadows of the alley, leaving their injured friends behind. Scott stood tall, his chest heaving, but his eyes stayed fixed on the two men lying on the ground. One was groaning in pain, holding his arm, while the other struggled to sit up, clutching his leg. I finally found my voice. "Scott, good boy," I said, my voice shaky. My hand reached down to touch his head, and he looked up at me briefly, his tail giving a small wag before returning to his protective stance. The danger had passed, but Scott had proven himself yet again. My dog, my hero, had saved my life. I stood there, my legs trembling beneath me as I held Scott's leash tightly. Two of the men were still on the ground, groaning in pain. The others had run off, but these two weren't going anywhere. My heart was pounding, but I couldn't help feeling a surge of pride as I looked at Scott. He stood tall, calm now, his sharp eyes still watching for any sign of trouble. Pulling out my phone with shaky hands, I dialed the police. "This is Samuel Johnson," I told the operator. "I've been attacked, but my dog handled it. I need officers here quickly." One of the thugs groaned, clutching his arm. "You and that mutt are crazy," he muttered, glaring up at me. I tightened my grip on Scott's leash and leaned closer, keeping my voice steady. "That mutt just saved my life. Maybe next time you'll think twice before trying to rob an old man." Another thug, holding his injured leg, spat on the ground. "You got lucky, old man. That's all it was, luck." I stared at him, my fear now replaced with anger. "Luck had nothing to do with it," I said firmly. "You messed with the wrong man and his dog." The sound of sirens cut through the quiet street, and within minutes, 2 police cars pulled up. Officers stepped out quickly, taking in the scene. Me, the 2 injured men on the ground, and Scott standing protectively by my side. One officer, a tall man with sharp features, froze when his eyes landed on Scott. His expression shifted from confusion to surprise. "No way," he said, walking closer. "Is that Scott?" I nodded, unsure of what he meant. "Yes, this is Scott. He's my dog." The officer's face lit up with recognition. "I trained with him years ago. He's a legend in the force. Best K9 we ever had. I can't believe it's him." Hearing this, I couldn't help but smile, even as my legs still felt unsteady. Well, he's retired now, but he hasn't forgotten his training. The officer crouched down, his voice soft as he spoke to Scott. "Good boy, Scott. Still protecting and serving, huh?" Scott wagged his tail slightly, his stance relaxing just a bit. Meanwhile, the 2 thugs tried to protest. "We didn't do anything," one of them yelled. "That dog just attacked us for no reason." The officer shook his head, unimpressed. "Save it. I know Scott, and I know he doesn't attack unless there's a reason. Besides, you 2 don't look so innocent lying there." The officers cuffed the men and hauled them to their feet, ignoring their complaints. As they were led to the squad cars, one officer turned to me and said, "Your dog is incredible, sir. He deserves a medal." I looked down at Scott, who was now sitting calmly by my side. "He's more than incredible," I said quietly. "He's my hero." The next morning, I woke up to the sound of my phone ringing non-stop. Groggy and a bit annoyed, I finally picked up, and it was my neighbor on the other end, practically shouting, "Samuel, turn on the news. You and Scott are everywhere." Still half asleep, I shuffled over to the TV and switched it on. There it was, footage of the incident from the day before. Someone had recorded the entire thing on their phone. The video showed Scott taking down the attackers, his bravery on full display. The reporter's voice played over the clip, describing how my retired police dog had saved me from being mugged by 5 men. They called Scott a hero, a symbol of courage and loyalty. Before I could even process what I was seeing, there was a knock at the door. By mid-morning, the quiet little street outside my home had turned into a circus. Reporters, cameras, and neighbors gathered on my lawn, all wanting to see the dog that had become an overnight sensation. I stood by the door, overwhelmed, while Scott sat proudly beside me. The reporters bombarded me with questions. "Mr. Johnson, how does it feel to have a dog like Scott? What was going through your mind during the attack? How is Scott handling all this attention?" I did my best to answer, though I was still trying to wrap my head around it all. "Scott is more than just a dog," I told them. "He's my companion, my protector, and now it seems, everyone's hero." Throughout the day, people from the neighborhood stopped by to show their support. Some brought bags of treats and new toys for Scott. Others brought handwritten notes and cards. Most of them came from children, which warmed my heart. One young boy approached shyly, holding a large envelope in his hands. "My mom helped me write this," he said, handing it to me before running back to his parents. I thanked him and set the envelope aside while I continued greeting visitors. That evening, when the house was finally quiet, I sat down and opened the envelope. Inside was a letter that brought me to tears. "Dear Mr. Johnson, thank you for taking care of Scott. He's a hero, not just today, but also in the past. A few years ago, during his time as a police dog, Scott saved my dad's life during a robbery at his store. My dad always talked about how brave Scott was. Now we see that he's still the same incredible dog. Please give him a big hug from our family. Sincerely, Jason and the Thompson family." I knelt beside Scott, stroking his fur, my voice thick with emotion. "You've always been a hero, haven't you?" Scott wagged his tail as if he understood. A week later, the community honored Scott with a ceremony at the local center. They unveiled a monument with a plaque that read, "Scott, protector of the community and friend to all." Children and adults lined up to take pictures with Scott, showering him with love and gratitude. He accepted it all with quiet dignity, calm as ever. For me, the moment wasn't just about Scott's bravery. It was about our bond, the courage that love inspires, and how a community can come together to celebrate a hero like Scott. As I sat on the couch that evening, Scott resting his head on my lap, I couldn't help but reflect on everything that had happened. It had been a whirlwind of a day, filled with reporters, neighbors, and even complete strangers coming by to celebrate Scott. But more than anything, it was a day that reminded me of the true meaning of courage. Sometimes courage comes in the most unexpected forms. I've always thought of myself as old and frail, someone who's seen better days. But Scott showed me that strength isn't about how young or strong you are. It's about having the right support by your side. Even when you feel small or weak, there's always a way to fight back. Scott's bravery reminded me that we all have the ability to stand up for ourselves, no matter the odds. And it's not just about standing up for yourself. It's about protecting and cherishing those you care about. Life is precious, and the love we share with others makes us stronger than we realize. If you enjoyed this story of courage and loyalty, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. I'll see you in the next one. Take care and give your loved ones a hug tonight.